next presenter is Blake Rafferty. And speaking of communication, we are going to be looking at EEG rhythms, but in communication and in language. And moving to back to the back end of the brain, to the left-fusiform gyrus, which is one of my favorite regions of brain. So Blake, take it away.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Great, so yeah, hi, I'm Blake, and I'm really interested in how EEG rhythms correspond to linguistic processes, specifically syntax. So there's some recent evidence that suggests that syntax might be reflected neurologically via power increases in delta oscillations, which are a slow wave kind of oscillation. Specifically, the study by Banaj et al. In 2017 compared these sentence fragments that had some evidence of grammatical structure, like I have pictured here on the left. They were yesterday evening they compared those fragments to ungrammatical word lists, which were essentially scrambled versions of the same words. And they found that delta power was higher generally across the entire length of these grammatically structured sentence fragments. And they interpreted this to suggest that there's some type of syntactic consolidation of the individual words into unified units, which is in linguistic kind of literature referred to as unification or merge, and that higher delta power corresponded to that activity. But since syntax and language processing in general is really time sensitive, it wasn't really clear if that's what this result represented in their study, because they used a variety of different grammatical patterns in their sentence fragments. And so they were kind of forced to average across the entire sentence instead of looking at specific time points. But considering their results, we wanted to kind of build upon that by essentially studying grammar and syntactic processes and including information in the time domain. So in a previous study, we designed sentence stimuli to compare essentially word sets that formed complete grammatical units or constituents. They were little noun phrases that had like a determiner like the word the, and a pseudo word like the word moop. We used pseudo words instead of real English words because it kind of limited the effect that semantics might have on the processes that we were looking at. And then we compared those little short noun phrases to the same words, but in a reversed order. And these didn't comprise any specific grammatical violations, but they were incomplete, and so they didn't form a complete constituent. And then as a control condition, we also included some familiar and unfamiliar pseudo word sequences. These essentially had no syntactic structure and no semantic information. So they kind of served as a control. And what we found was that following the noun phrases that formed complete grammatical constituents, delta power was highest, specifically after the second word, which is exactly when we would expect these kind of grammatical processes to be taking place. But we also observed increased delta power for the incomplete constituents compared to the word list. And so because these didn't really form a complete grammatical unit, we didn't think it could be this kind of unification or consolidation of words into a single kind of working memory representation, because you can't really do that to an incomplete unit like on something like moop the. But this kind of phrasal pattern does have some grammatical information, so it's possible that participants were still trying to interpret these incomplete constituents as grammatical. And so considering that, it's possible then that instead of this kind of syntactic unification process, that delta oscillations increase as participants try and build our syntactic structure as they're parsing language. But to really verify that approach, there are a couple questions that still needed to be answered. Specifically, how do delta oscillations change when sentences have multiple grammatical units? You know, a noun phrase is one thing, but when you have a lot of different moving parts, you know, do delta oscillations kind of match that? And if it does, if it represents this building of hierarchical, you know, grammatical structures, then we really should see differences at the edges of these grammatical structures rather than just across the entire sentence. So what we did is we wanted to use time frequency analysis to kind of characterize delta responses at specific time points in sentences that had these fixed grammatical patterns. So we used this these fixed patterns essentially because, yeah, it let us look at specific time points. And we built 4 sets of stimuli. The first one were sentences that followed the pattern of the English cause-motion construction, which is a pretty common grammatical structure in the English language, something like the man pulled the boat down the dock. And we compared that to the same words, but in a scrambled order. And essentially that comparison, the scrambled sentences had no real semblance of syntactic structure. And in addition to that, we wanted to still control for any effects of lexico-semantic content present in the sentences. We wanted to make sure that our effect was really related to the grammatical structure. And so we modified these cause-motion constructions by replacing all of the content words, the meaningful words, with pseudo words. So instead of the man pulled the boat down the dock, we had something like the pob gurped the hink down the jarm, which grammatically is well formed, but semantically it really doesn't mean much. And we also wanted to kind of provide a similar control to the scrambled English conditions. So we created a scrambled version of the pseudo word Jabberwocky sentences that were, just scrambled. We had 2 different main comparisons that we were interested in. The first one was to see how grammatical structure affected delta oscillations. So to kind of explore that, we combined the English and pseudo word cause-motion constructions and compared those to the combined scrambled sentence patterns. And we also wanted to see how semantic content affected delta oscillations. So for that comparison, we combined the English cause-motion and English scrambled sentences and compared that to the combined pseudo word cause-motion sentence and the pseudo word scrambled. So for our actual experiment, we had 23 right-handed females. I work in speech pathology, so there are primarily female students, which is why we did that. And we fitted them with an EEG cap before they entered an electromagnetically shielded booth. And after we seated them inside, we presented stimuli to them visually, 1 word at a time. Each word came on the screen in the middle of the screen and was there for 500 milliseconds and before it was replaced with the subsequent word. Participants were asked to read the sentences silently. And then following the sentence, there was a set of stars on the screen that essentially cued participants to press a button on a keypad that would start the next trial. And the stars that I have pictured here above the timeline correspond to essentially the points in the sentences where full constituents could be formed. So these are really the time windows that I was most interested in. All right, so here I have the results of the time frequency analyses that we did on each of these different comparisons. Here I have the delta oscillatory power at the time points that each word was on the screen. The black lines correspond to the nonsense or the pseudo word condition. The green corresponds to the English condition. And then I have the scalp distribution of that delta power pictured here across the timeline as well. There's really no large effects of lexico-semantic content here, except for after word 5, where the pseudo word condition, where there was actually no lexical or semantic information, actually caused higher delta power than the English condition. And we thought that was kind of strange. So we looked at our stimulus material and we found that it was possible that in the scrambled pseudo word condition, as well as the pseudo word condition with grammatical structure, words 4 and 5 could have formed a grammatical unit in all cases. So we think that this is kind of an effect of that, but it's impossible to say for sure. And then the comparisons that I was most interested in are the effect of grammatical structure. So the blue lines represent delta power for the grammatical sentences and the red ones represent for the scrambled sentences. And the edges of the constituents occurred at word 2, word 3, word 5, and word 8. And as the gray highlighting essentially indicates time points where the conditions were significantly different. And as you can see, the grammatical sentences were higher at all of the constituent boundaries, so all the edges of the syntactic units. And there was almost this kind of pattern of delta activity increasing until a full constituent was formed, and then a somewhat resetting that occurred when a new constituent was started. When we looked at the scalp distribution for these, they looked pretty posterior, which is not super common or it's not the primary areas that people tend to think of for linguistic and specifically syntactic processing. So we wanted to conduct some source analysis to identify what cortical areas are most responsible for these differences. So to do that, we used dynamic imaging of coherent sources, which is just a distributed dipole method to essentially see how power within a specific frequency range is distributed across the brain. And the results of these analysis really gave us 3 specific clusters of activity that differentiated the grammatical sentences from the ungrammatical sentences. And those were in the superior frontal gyrus, as well as the anterior portion of the middle temporal gyrus. And then the largest cluster of activity was actually focal to the fusiform gyrus, but was spread across the visual association areas. The fusiform gyrus has been suggested as this kind of interface between sensory and conceptual systems in visual processing that can be kind of used to facilitate more efficient visual processing. And so it's really common to see it activated in reading tasks like the one that we used here. In addition to this, delta oscillations coming from prefrontal areas have been suggested to exhibit top-down control mechanisms over sensory processes. And so, considering these things together, we thought that it's possible that these delta oscillations that emerge from prefrontal and visual association areas really reflect the integration of the visual sentence stimuli with the top-down knowledge that participants had with syntactic structure. So yeah, to kind of sum things up, the main findings we had were that delta power doesn't really appear to be modulated by lexical-semantic content, but it does appear to increase as participants build linguistic structure and then reset after full grammatical units could be formed. And then the source results we kind of found came from prefrontal and visual association areas, which might reflect integrating the syntactic information with the incoming sentence stimuli that they had. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Blake. And people, but don't be shy about asking questions. I don't see any questions in our chat, and I'm happy to ask questions till the cows come home.
Sure. Go ahead.
Actually, and I was gonna, in fact, I'm going to, because Blake, I have a question, because I was thinking about when you were presenting your introduction, that how we recognize different word types. And it occurred to me that is it possible that in some way this delta kind of activity that we're seeing varies as a function of word type in some way?
It's possible. And that was part of the inspiration for us including the pseudo words, just because they didn't really have any obvious word type. So if it was sensitive to that, then we would have expected to see that difference between the English and the pseudo word comparisons. But pseudo words are obviously not a super naturalistic language stimuli. So it's possible still that in more naturalistic settings, something like a determiner like the word the and a noun might differentially affect delta oscillations. Okay,
and then since no one else is stepping up, I'm happy to ask more. When you showed your DICS source modeling, and those data looked very nice. Did you get individual MRIs in each subject when you for those?
Yeah, no, unfortunately not. Those were just a general MNI kind of MRI for us.
Okay,
we just that's projected on.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Well, if there are no further